Morning, Treasurer. The data provided in the Gazette on Friday, last Friday, May 30, showed that the new Emergency Services and Volunteer Fund will cover 43.3% of the costs of the new funding recipients, SES, 000, Forest Fire Management Victoria, etc. Collectively, this tallies up to $464 million for 25-26, which is a saving of $464 million to consolidated revenue. Where in the budget can we find a tax cut for Victorians of the equivalent amount, given that they're now paying that $464 million from the new Emergency Services and Volunteers Fund?
Your question's a little jumbled for me, Ms. Benham. Sorry.
That's okay. So
you're asking about the Gazette, or you're asking about the budget papers, or you're asking about tax?
We're asking about the figures that we've taken from the Gazette that we illustrate the forecast funding requirements for each funding recipient in the Gazette on Friday.
Yes.
That totaled $464 million that will come from for the new services to be funded from the Emergency Services and Volunteers Fund. That will fund 43.3% of the new recipients of that would normally be funded from consolidated revenue. So where in the budget papers is that saving or the tax cut for Victorians of $464 million?
I think the problem that I have with the way you've articulated your question is that you are making an assumption that the Emergency Services and Volunteer Fund is the only funding allocation for emergency services.
No. That funds the 43.3% of the new funding recipients. Forest Fire Management, 000, Vic SES, Emergency Management Victoria, State Control Centre, Emergency Recovery Victoria, Emergency Alert Program, and the Emergency Management Operational Communication Program. They're all funded to 43.3%. So doing those figures based on that adds up to $464 million coming from this fund. All of those programs are currently funded from consolidated revenue. Now, almost half of that...
Well, I don't accept the premise of your question. Let me answer it in this way. The way you're articulating your question is taking us down an incorrect assessment. There will be more money for emergency services. The emergency management output is increasing. So is there a particular issue you have with the funding provisions to anything in the emergency services portfolio?
We're trying to get to the point of, at the moment, right now, without the Emergency Services and Volunteers Fund, these services are currently wholly funded from consolidated revenue. So if they are to be funded to the tune of 43.3% being raised from the Emergency Services Fund, is there a tax cut for Victorians to the same figure?
No.
Or is there... Okay, thank you. So the decision to pause the Emergency Services and Volunteers Fund for drought-affected farmers that was announced last week will cost the budget around $73 million.
Yep.
That will reduce the revenue raised by it from $1.623 billion, as per the budget papers, to $1.55 billion, as shown in the Gazette on Friday. And you've said, as you said earlier, every cent goes towards emergency services. So the breakdown of this levy money to all of the funding recipients tallies 1.538, leaving a difference of $12 million. So why are we shortchanging emergency services by $12 million, and where is that $12 million going?
But again, Ms. Benham, what you're trying to articulate is a false narrative. The Emergency Services Volunteer Fund raises a component of funding for emergency services, 90 and 95% for SES, FRV, CFA, reduced for other emergency services organisations to reflect their direct interactions with emergency services. We will continue to fund more and above what what the levy raises on our emergency services, as we have year after year with the fire services property levy. This is just a sustainable funding model designed to ensure that base funding is supplemented and continues to be stable, so that we can we are in the best position to respond to more frequent, more serious disasters that hit our state, and to ensure that all of the funding goes to that endeavour. That's what the legislation is all about. You mentioned the 73 million as a result of making the appropriate decision to ensure that drought-impacted farmers aren't seeing any increase. When I made that announcement with the Premier last week, I made the firm commitment that that change does not impact any of the commitments that we have made in relation to the funds that will be made available for emergency services, particularly in relation to the new trucks and expenditure that...
Treasurer, there's a $12 million shortfall between the revenue raise, the forecast revenue in the 25-26 levy year, now with $73 million left, and what is actually being funded. And these figures are all listed in Friday's Gazette. It comes to $1.538 billion, not the $1.55 billion. You've said that all funds should go to emergency services, so why aren't they?
Ms Benham, as you'd appreciate, the Gazette, have you got a copy of the Gazette?
I have got it in front of me.
So the Gazettal only outlines the ESF money to emergency services. It doesn't include the additional funding that I've started to outline, and it doesn't include the cost of collecting the revenue. The $12 million is admin costs.
So it costs $12 million to collect this, even though councils are doing it.
I would refer you to the footnote that is under the Gazette. These estimated amounts do not include government statutory contributions, ad hoc funding provided throughout the levy year, or administrative costs associated with the levy and volunteer offset scheme.
Administrative to the tune of $12 million? Councils don't want to do it. Is that indicating that the state
councils
might take it off?
Councils were asking for admin costs directly. That was their ask.
They are also asking to not have to not be the collection agency.
Well, that was your former government. Your former government introduced.
Couldn't the $12 million
proposal
Couldn't the $12 million be used for the State Revenue Office to collect this? Seeing every council in this state doesn't want to collect it.
The Royal Commission that followed Black Saturday fires made the recommendation that the coalition government at the time introduced this as the appropriate mechanism for collecting a levy for fire services.
So the $12 million is going to councils?
Funding already goes to councils
to
collect
the $12 million
the fire services property levy. What we're doing is expanding it to ensure the likes of SES can be included in the fund. We actually aren't changing the collection mechanism that was introduced by your government.
So is the $12 million going to support those administration costs with councils?
As I indicated in the footnote, some of that cost will be in relation to administrative costs. We're continuing to consult with the MAV and councils in relation to supporting them, as we always have, pre the changes. The commitment that I gave through the legislation was to ensure that they could be provided ongoing administrative support, and some of the funds will support that, yes.
So let's move on to the budgets then. If we can have a look at the breakdown of these budgets.
Which budgets?
The ones listed in the Gazette, and
Ms Benham, just for the sake of the committee, you just need to provide the budget papers, which I think will help direct all of us to what we're supposed to be looking at.
Sure. The budget paper that we're referring to, obviously, is... it's listed in here. Have you got it there, Richard?
Yeah, that's because of the surge.
It is budget paper 3, page 158.
Yep.
But we're talking about the funding levels for the emergency services and the emergency services fund. So if we have a look at, and the last full year's funding figures that we've been able to get from your office during the bill briefing process was from 23-24. And if we have a look, FRV being funded from the Emergency Services Volunteer Fund. 90% of their funding comes from that fund, which equals the 761,772,000, which is 90% of the total budget of being around 846,413,000. In 23-24, that figure was 961,403,000. So the funding levels have dropped to the tune of nearly $115 million.
Yeah, it's kind of outside the scope of the committee, but I think it is. So what I'll point to, so Ms Benham's referring to the Gazettal, which for the benefit of the committee is not part of the budget papers, as you'd appreciate. In the discussions for the legislation, one of the amendments that was put forward by the Greens Party actually was wanting to see a breakdown so that we could demonstrate to all Victorians that every dollar raised by the Emergency Services Volunteer Fund would be going to emergency services. In relation to the figures that you've been quoting, I want to put it very, very clearly on record, and you'll be able to check this again with the Minister for Emergency Services later on this afternoon. There is no funding cuts to any emergency service organisations, and there won't be. Any statement to the contrary is wrong, absolutely wrong.
These are your
every single dollar raised by the Emergency Services Fund goes back to the emergency services, and it's enshrined by legislation, which is what we've done.
So
since coming to government, we've doubled the annual funding for emergency services that Victorians rely on, with nearly $2 billion allocated in 25-26 alone, and as you can see, that's indicated on the budget paper that you referenced at page 158. Overall funding for emergency services increased by 14% in that year alone. The gazetted figures don't account for all funding provided to emergency services, and their estimated forecast reflects the proportion of each budget funded through the ESVF.
So the gazetted figures... Look, the gazetted figures are the figures that are funded through the Emergency Services and Volunteers Fund.
Which in no way represent the total funding.
No, but the figures are here, the percentage of funding of the recipient's budget. So it's not hard to work out, it's basic arithmetic, but it indicates that almost every single service, CFA, $42 million less than 23-24.
Ms Benham, I can be... Ms Benham.
Excuse me, Treasurer, Ms Benham, there's a point of order.
Thank you, Chair. I think the scope of the inquiry is the budget papers. The Treasurer has demonstrated she's very happy to answer questions on this, but relying on back of the envelope calculations by the member for Mildura to answer questions, I think we should stick to what's in the papers.
Chair,
excuse me, Ms Benham. On the point of order.
On the point of order, Chair, this is entirely relevant because the figures have now changed as of last Friday, when there was an announcement from the government that part of this fund would be suspended. So new figures have come out in the Gazette on Friday that do not add up. These are not back of the envelope. They are all pointed out in the Gazette on Friday. It is not hard to do some basic arithmetic to figure out that there has been cuts to everything.
Excuse me, Treasurer. Excuse me, Treasurer. You cannot raise a point of order here before the committee. I'll rule on the point of order. The Treasurer is attempting to answer your question, despite the Gazette not forming part of the budget papers, which the Treasurer has acknowledged. The Treasurer is doing us the courtesy of answering your question, despite it partly being outside the budget. The Treasurer, if you would like to answer Ms Benham's question, and we can move on.
Ms Benham, there is no cuts to any agency. In fact, the Emergency Service and Volunteer Fund is about ensuring that there is more money available for those agencies. What I do hold concerns about is those that are opposed to the change. That is their right. But to try and use an argument that is false to supplement your opposition is frankly immoral. So there is no cuts to emergency services
Treasurer,
through the changes.
Figures.
I'm explaining to you that the figures aren't the full expenditure for emergency services. There is more money through the changes, not less. There are no cuts.
When will we see updated figures?
These are forecasts.
When will we see updated figures that add up to more funding in the last full year that we already have, which is 23-24? Because at the moment, almost every single service listed is getting less funding under this model except for Emergency Management Operational Communication Program. When will we see updated budget figures?
Annual reports of the agencies will show the full breakdown of their expenses. There is no reduction in their base funding, no reduction in at all. And anything that you say to the contrary is false, and I'm sure the Minister for Emergency Services will back that up. What this is a guaranteed floor, which a lot of agencies in government would love, but it is not the total funding and there are no cuts. That's the whole purpose of the Emergency Service Volunteer Fund, was to provide more funding.
Which has been said multiple times, but again, it doesn't take, anyone can do the figures that have been provided. But let's move on.
Well, just
when we talk
why don't
about,
you go to page 158 of your budget paper.
When we talk about the Emergency Services and Volunteers Fund and the policy basis around increasing the farm rate by 150% to be 4 times higher than the residential rate, how do you justify that decision?
Ms Benham, you mightn't have been in the chamber in the upper house, which took many hours, which is what I'm quite used to. I'm more than happy to answer questions. The rationale for the Emergency Services Volunteer Fund is to raise additional funding so that Victorians have an emergency services funding model that supports the response required to protect Victorians. More frequent, more severe events. As a former emergency services minister, seen a lot of devastation out there. The recovery efforts alone are really expensive, and we want to make sure that we can continue to fund the expectations of Victorians, particularly in regional areas, especially regional Victorians. But Ms Benham, in particular, you haven't given a budget paper reference, but I assume that we're coming back to 158. And can I point to the Emergency Management Capability output summary, which demonstrates that in 24-25, the amount of money that was allocated to that portfolio, the reason that is so high is that we funded the flood response. Like, this is how we fund emergency services. We have a sustainable funding model to support the base funding, and when required, as demonstrated between 24-25 and the revised 24-25, a massive injection of millions of dollars to ensure that Victorians could be supported.
How is it justifiable, given that farmers in this state are on their knees, to raise their rate by 150%? Given that we know the structure of farms, well, I know, I'm not sure if others are aware, that no farm is on one title alone. So this can be hundreds of thousands of dollars, increasing at a rate of 150%. How does the government justify that?
Ms Benham, again, you're outside the scope of...
We're completely within the scope. It's a brand new tax.
Outside the scope in relation to, you haven't provided a budget paper reference, but I'll give you the courtesy of...
Budget paper 3, page 158.
I will give you the courtesy of responding. As you indicated before, when you were able to identify the gazettal and the $73 million, the government is pausing, not having an increase on any primary production land in the entire state. That is a recognition of the harsh conditions that farmers are under. That is an extension of what we announced weeks ago to ensure that those in the southwest weren't paying any more either. So that is a recognition that it is tough out there.
A recognition that it was an immoral decision in the first place?
It is a recognition that we have a drought support package which is flowing and available to farmers across the state. There will be no additional cost for them in relation to the Emergency Services Volunteer Fund. And in fact, as you would appreciate, because you understand rural communities, many farmers are CFA volunteers.
Correct.
And because of the legislative changes, they will pay less or none in relation to the previous fire services property levy because we are exempting volunteers from the Emergency Services Volunteer Fund.
That is, in fact,
all of that
Treasurer,
will be very.
that is if, in fact, that volunteer's
easy.
name is listed on the title of the farm, and in most cases, farms are not listed under the name of an individual. They're held in family trusts or they're held in company names. So it becomes irrelevant.
I can get you, you're obviously not fully briefed on how it works. We've made arrangements so that a range of structures can benefit from the exemption. If you would like, Chair, I can offer Ms Benham a separate briefing outside of your hearing so that she understands where the exemptions apply. There is a lot of misinformation out there about the exemptions being difficult, and not applying to family trusts and the like. That's false, and I'm happy to give her the information because obviously for her community that would be particularly important. We have the ability to choose your principal place of residence or your farm if you're a farmer, 2 or more parcels of land in a single farming enterprise in which you have a direct or indirect interest can apply for the exemption. So apologies, Ms Benham, but your information is false and I would love to correct it because I think your community deserves facts.